maybe ready to start, so we don't need to enter too much in presentation and simply go into the talk.
Great. Sounds good. Sounds good.
Yeah.
I'd like to thank Enrico for the invitation and Institute and everyone for showing up on a beautiful day, including people online. So let me just say a few words about my interest in this topic, Nishida's conception of creativity. I do a lot of work on Heidegger, but I've also been working on the topic of creativity. Both the nature of creativity, what is it, and also the history of the concept. And so I've been looking recently at conceptions of creativity and in Asian philosophy, and that's what drew me to the Kyoto School. And so I'm on sabbatical right now, so I'm working on a sabbatical project on conceptions of creativity in the Kyoto School. And so a big part of that is Nishida, and so that's the part that I'm going to be presenting today. And I'd appreciate any feedback from people. That'll be helpful as I go back and revise this. So great. Let me get started. I guess we'll switch screen, or people can choose, you said so. Okay, well, let me get started. And again, remind me if I'm speaking too quickly. I'll make an effort to slow down. So one of the distinctive features of the philosophers associated with the Kyoto School is their interest in the topic of creativity, especially Nishida, Miki, Nishitani, and Watsuji. They gravitated towards strands in Eastern and Western philosophy that are highly relevant to this topic, and began writing at a time when interest in creativity was mushrooming, partly due to the reverberations of the theory of biological evolution and various technological advancements. The philosophers played a prominent role in these discussions. They were gradually overshadowed by researchers in the nascent field of empirical psychology, who continued to dominate this area. Miki, for one, was heavily engaged with the research on creativity in both philosophy and other disciplines, as much as any contemporaneous figure in Europe or the United States. However, this paper will focus on Nishida, who was the Kyoto School philosopher besides Miki that had the most to say about the topic of creativity. In fact, Nishida introduced the Kyoto School's most distinctive contribution to the discussion of creativity, the concept of nothingness, and he developed it in great detail. This paper is broken into sections addressing three general issues: the nature of novelty, the sources of creativity, and the nature of the creative process. Nishida and the other philosophers in the Kyoto School that I've mentioned address some aspects of the nature of novelty, though it wasn't a major topic of discussion for them. However, introducing this issue will help us to get our bearings and will highlight possible differences of opinion that will become relevant later in the paper. The second section is where we'll begin examining Nishida's views in detail. For the sources of creativity was an important issue for him and the other Kyoto School philosophers. Finally, we'll turn to Nishida's conception of the creative process. We'll see that his views about this are closer to some of the other Kyoto School philosophers than some of them rather than others, but also that he addressed this issue in less detail than the previous one. However, I'll attempt to fill in the picture somewhat by considering Miki's views about the creative process. Let's start by discussing the nature of novelty, which will provide some helpful context regarding the broader topic of creativity. What does novelty have to do with creativity? Creativity is usually defined as the ability to generate something novel, or the act of doing this. Novelty itself is normally understood as something new or unprecedented. In a certain sense, novelty is virtually ubiquitous. For example, every element is temporally unprecedented in the sense that it's the first time that such and such is happening at this particular moment in time. Similarly, individual physical objects have accidental features, such as small imperfections, that distinguish them from every other individual object of the same type. These examples of novelty may seem trivial, but when people refer to novelty and creativity, on occasion, they apply the terms in a very broad manner. For example, Nishitani stated that from the viewpoint of karma, quote, each individual is determined by its ties and causal kinship with an endless world nexus. And yet each instance of individual existence and behavior, as well as each moment of their time, arises as something totally new, possessed of freedom and creativity, end quote. However, people usually have in mind something much more limited in scope, working from the assumption that only certain entities are novel and only some acts are creative, or at least are novel or creative in a manner worth paying attention to. This exclusionary attitude is reflected in the fact that we normally understand novelty to be both unprecedented and significant. We tend to ascribe novelty only to new developments that we believe are important, such as noteworthy artworks or technologies. And this is how Nishida and the other Kyoto School philosophers I've mentioned normally use the term. For example, we'll see that Nishida contrasted carpentry with art, using the former as an example of something that is too reproductive and derivative to be characterized as creative. Let's consider a couple of other distinctions related to novelty. If simple reproduction isn't significant enough to be considered novel, what about discovery? Uncovering an unfamiliar feature of reality can be significant. For example, an unfamiliar biological species or mathematical property. But discovery is less likely to be considered novel than invention is, bringing a certain type of thing into existence that didn't exist previously. The issue here isn't that discoveries aren't seen as being significant, but rather that their unprecedentedness is weaker since the entity in question already existed in some sense. As far as I can tell, Miki was the only Kyoto School philosopher we're discussing here who explicitly distinguished between invention and discovery. However, these other philosophers appear to assume this distinction, as seen in their tendency to characterize science as being less creative than art and other fields in which invention is predominant. Let's consider one more aspect of novelty about which there appear to be conflicting views among the Kyoto School philosophers. We've already discussed the view that some things are novel and others aren't. Is it possible that some things are more novel than others, namely that novelty is a matter of degree? For example, we sometimes rank entities, for example, movies, technological devices, and scientific hypotheses according to the amount of novelty that we think they possess. An alternative view is that novelty is an all or nothing affair, that novel entities are completely unprecedented. For example, Nishitani and Watsuji both claim that certain novel entities are completely unprecedented. Nishitani asserts that the world of karma, quote, or in the world of karma, quote, each individual is determined by its ties and causal kinship with an endless world nexus. And yet each instance of individual existence and behavior as well as each moment of their time, arises as something totally new, possessed of freedom and creativity, end quote. He contrasts the underlying conception of history here with one in which, quote, everything is reduced to the standpoint of the universal and nothing essentially new can occur, end quote. And in reference to the actualization of Japan's future mission, Watsuji states, quote, to employ Bergson's way of speaking, this actualization will be a totally new creation. It must not just be the case of something which has previously appeared as an idea becoming actualized. However, Nishida seems to take the opposing view. Early in his career, he claimed, quote, in thought, a genius's intuition differs not in quality, but in degree from ordinary thinking. And it is simply a new, profound intuition of unity, end quote. And toward the end of his career, using Leibniz's notion of singularity, he writes, quote, the world which is given to the individual self is not a general world, but a singular one. The more we are individuals, the more this is true. This can also be expressed in the opposite way. The more the world is singular, the more individual is the individual, end quote. Of course, it's possible that Nishitani, Watsuji, and Nishida all agree that some instances of novelty are completely unprecedented and others are a matter of degree. However, the apparent disagreement in these quotations suggests different positions regarding the nature of the creative process, which we'll return to later. Get a drink of water. Let's turn to the issue of the sources of creativity, namely what types of entities have this ability. In discussions of creativity, a variety of different sources have been proposed. For example, individual human beings, social groups, divinities, non-human animals, and biological evolution. Each of these possible sources were defended by one or more of the Kyoto school philosophers I mentioned. In addition, they made a distinct contribution to this discussion, maintaining that there's another source, in fact, the fundamental source of creativity, nothingness, as it's understood in the Buddhist tradition. Nishida's list of the sources of creativity is relatively short. Individual human beings, God, and nothingness. In fact, through much of his career, God appears to be equated with nothingness. And toward the end, when he separated the two, he no longer viewed nothingness as the source of creativity, but now as a process underlying it. According to Nishida, individual human beings are a key locus of creativity because they have a dialectical consciousness. The latter is lacking in inanimate nature as well as organisms such as non-human animals. In Nishida's view, the activity of a non-human animal is merely instinctive, for it is absorbed into the universality of its respective species and, quote, bears within itself unconsciously the world which forms itself, end quote. Quote, in biological life, the individual still cannot be said truly to determine itself. And this is the reason that it is merely biological life, end quote, and lacks creativity. Additionally, in organic life, there is, quote, no true confrontation of past and future, and there is no true historical present, end quote. Nishida notes that humans retain this instinctive animality, which he connects with ordinary productive activities like carpentry. However, Their historical and dialectical consciousness enables individual human beings to become aware of their production and transcend the status of merely being a made thing and to become a making thing as well. In contrast, for non-human animals, being a making thing is limited to the species level due to their instinctive nature. Nishida distinguishes between the making of ordinary production, such as carpentry, and human activities that are capable of creativity. Quote, an artistic work differs fundamentally from a manufactured product. It is not made in accordance with a certain goal. It does not move from the many to the one, rather it moves from the one to the many, end quote. Like art, morality and religion have a special status for Nishida. In the early part of his career, he tended to equate morality and religion, but later on he separated them. These three activities in which we can express ourselves in a dialectical manner these three are activities in which we can express ourselves in a dialectical manner that synthesizes universality with individual personality and synthesizes the past into the present activity that shapes and reshapes one's conception of the future. For example, Nishida maintains that these activities have a concreteness lacking in science. Quote, the historical world provides the scientific world with its concrete, objective foundation, but art and religion are even more concrete. For in history, pure thought is still attempting to unify the whole of experience, whereas art and religion can turn and view it from the more concrete standpoint of complete personality. The a priori underlying all a priori, whose universality is not that of an abstract concept, but of creative power, end quote. As a result, these activities are able to establish an identity between the self and the resulting work or act that is lacking in other domains. Quote, creativity is usually understood to imply that the act that creates and the thing created are different. However, a true creative act must create its own content from within itself, end quote. However, Nishida claims that morality and religion have more capability in this regard than art, since their product is indeed the self instead of an external work. Toward the end of his career, Nishida distinguished morality and religion in a similar manner. Though morality directly concerns the self, quote, the self's very existence does not become problematic, end quote, in it because it works from, quote, the presupposition of one's own continued existence, end quote. As a result, morality is only a preparatory stage for religion, and religion is the culmination of our self-development. The shift in Nishida's views about the relationship between morality and religion may reflect contemporaneous changes in his view about the status of God, which we will address shortly. As previously noted, nothingness is another important source of creativity for Nishida through several phases of his career. In fact, it is the fundamental source, something that Nishida underscores by drawing an analogy to the theological notion of the ex nihilo creation of the universe. If nothingness is the fundamental source, how does it relate to human creativity? We've seen that, according to Nishida, human beings create via a dialectical consciousness that synthesizes oppositions and unifies time. In his view, this dialectical consciousness arises in us as a result of us entering nothingness, since creative synthesis is a property of nothingness. Nishida brought together the dialectical notion of negation and the Buddhist conception of paradoxical yet productive nothingness. We enter the locus of nothingness through an act of self-negation. And this is what enables us to experience the synthetic union of opposites that transforms us and generates new ideas and works. This is related to Nishida's claim that a genius has a, quote, profound intuition of unity, end quote, that expresses, quote, a greater social good, end quote. In human creativity, we can connect with something greater than ourselves, and how deeply we connect with it determines the degree of creativity. Quote, because our infinite spirit is never fundamentally satisfied by the unity constituted by an individual self, it inevitably seeks a larger unity, a great self that envelops both oneself and others. We come to express sympathy toward others and seek congruence and unity between oneself and others, end quote. The more deeply a person enters into nothingness, the more broadly they connect with the surrounding world, and the more fundamentally the person transforms themselves. At several points in his career, Nishida reconceived the way human beings connect with nothingness, in pure experience, in acts of willing, and in place, the locus of dynamic creative activity in which we and other entities are no longer divided into subjects and objects. However, he reconceived nothingness even more radically during the 1930s, spurred in part by Tanabe's claim that he had reified nothingness by conceiving it as an all-encompassing container, and as a result was unable to adequately address creativity. Formerly, Nishida had characterized nothingness as the transcendent source of all things. Later, he decentered and desubstantialized nothingness, treating it as a process that is found in the self and the various entities in the world, emerging in their deepest interiority as the capability for a self-negation and self-transcendence that connects them to other entities. Nishida also reconceived the locus of human beings in the creative dialectic. Earlier, he claimed that we enter the synthetic center, where transcendent nothingness is found. In his later work, human beings remain firmly situated at the pole of subjectivity and particularity, with our counterpart, the world, found at the other end. Both sides are intermittently transformed through a dialectical interplay, without becoming unified in a central location. Still, human beings remain the immediate impetus for these instances of synthetic transformation. It is we who decide to creatively engage our inner selves and our dialectical relationship with the world, instead of the world initiating this act. There's another important element in Nishida's later account, however, namely God. God was a prominent topic in an inquiry into the good, but gradually receded into the background of Nishida's writings. In the earlier phases of Nishida's career, divinity is an impersonal metaphysical presence, transcendent and absolute. It sounds like another name for nothingness. For example, Nishida claims that, quote, the true God is not a creative God, but must be something like the so-called Gottheit of the mystics, end quote. In connection with the increased prominence of religion in Nishida's later work, the conception of God shifted to that of a loving being with which we have a personal relationship. Nishida was still critical of the idea of an anthropomorphized creator God, such as an intelligent designer or supernatural artisan. And along with this reconception of nothingness, he now rejected the notion of ex nihilo creation. However, God remains situated at the center of dialectical synthesis, which Nishida had formerly associated with nothingness. But this is no longer a place that human beings enter. Rather, God's presence extends to the self and the creative world in the dialectical interplay, where transcendence dialectically interconnects with the immanent and the absolute with the relative. Though each of us determines whether or not to dialectically engage with the world, God calls us to do so, especially to engage with other human beings in brotherly love. And God gives us the capacity for these self-transforming relationships and becomes present in them. According to Nishida, it is here that we see divine creation, an instance of self-expression through self-negation resulting from God's dialectical interplay with immanent relative beings. In the latter part of Nishida's career, he emphasized the interconnection of all entities, including socio-historical connections. In his view, it is nothingness, the inner capacity for self-negation, that dialectically connects everything. The fact that the later Nishida characterizes the world as a creative world suggests that I should qualify my earlier claim that nature and social groups aren't sources of creativity for him. In this later period, he emphasized that self-transformation happens alongside the transformation of the world due to their dialectical opposition. More specifically, he held that the world and the entities in it are transformed along with our conception of them, which is part of the process of historical development. Here, Nishida extended our creative libidinous quality to other entities in the world. According to him, quote, desiring means that we are mirroring the world in ourselves. It means that we make the world the medium for the formation of the self, end quote. This pertains not only to our understanding of biological and social development, but to inanimate entities as well. Quote, if the physical world changes by means of our observation, then even the physicist's world is a form of the historical world. Historical reality is creative, and the creative process changes. Even the physical world is not changeless. It is newly and creatively develops. Or it newly and creatively develops, end quote. Though natural and social entities aren't independent sources of creativity, unlike human beings, from the later Nishida's perspective, they are creative nonetheless. One implication of the creativity of the world is that changes in our understanding of the world lead dialectically to changes in the self. For example, Nishida discussed, quote, the environment which determines the individual through the self-determination of the environment, end quote. Additionally, he wrote, quote, I create something. Although created by me, it takes on a life of its own, independent of me, and acts upon me in turn. I make it, but it becomes a public thing. In short, a historical thing. And thereby, I myself am changed and continue to be so, end quote. This brings to mind the idea of situational creativity that David Hall and Roger Ames have identified in classical Chinese philosophy. They've argued in various works that Taoist and Confucian notions, such as non-action and integrity, contain an idea of human creativity as something interactive and interdependent with the world. as opposed to the traditional Western conception of creativity modeled on the notion of unidirectional causation and power, as illustrated by the idea of creation ex nihilo. Nishida's later account of the interplay between the self and the creative world appears to be an example of the situational conception of creativity identified by Hall and Ames. Let's turn to the third and final topic, the nature of the creative process. Historically, there have been two main theories about the creative process: intuitionism and associationism. As we'll see, both of them were discussed by Miki. Intuitionism claims that novel ideas, works, and entities are generated through intuition, a mysterious inner sense or feeling, like the élan vital Bergson ascribed to all biological organisms. In contrast, associationism maintains that these novel things are generated through accidental combinations or modifications of ideas, images, or entities occurring in the imagination or the physical world. There are simple versions of each of these theories, but also more complex ones that incorporate additional elements. For example, in the case of human creativity, intuition and association can be understood as a central stage which is sandwiched between other stages consisting in ordinary varieties of thinking. Some that prepare for intuition or association by, for example, focusing on a particular issue or problem and examining it and potential resources for a solution. And other stages that take an idea or work generated in an intuitive or associative manner and apply it or further develop it. There's also a third, more recent theory about the creative process, which maintains that human creativity consists solely in ordinary varieties of thinking. According to this view, we generate novel ideas or works simply with garden variety abilities like observation, analysis, and inference. But this theory was little known at the time that the Kyoto School philosophers were working, and remains that way today. As it turns out, these Kyoto School philosophers all appear to have been intuitionists, though they seem to have gravitated towards different varieties of intuitionism. At its simplest, intuitionism amounts to little more than the claim that the emergence of novel entities is mysterious, almost like a kind of divine inspiration or spontaneous generation. This tells us virtually nothing about how the creative process works, and few philosophers have defended this variety of intuitionism. A more sophisticated and explanatory type of intuitionism employs the concept of holism to clarify how novel entities are generated. On this theory, several individual components are seamlessly fused to produce something new that is different in kind from the original components. Commonly cited examples include mixing blue and yellow to produce the color green, and the combination of two hydrogen atoms and one oxygen atom, all gases at room temperature, to produce water, a liquid. Intuitionists of this variety maintain that since the novel whole and its parts are different in kind, the fusion of the parts into the whole is mysterious and can't be clarified by merely examining the parts. In this vein, Nishitani claimed that, quote, whatever appears in its aspect of eidos always presents itself as a whole. Man's intellect, too, takes its start from this whole as a given, even though it can then go on endlessly analyzing this whole into component elements. Our intellect is incapable of creating the original whole with its eidos by starting from the mass of analyzed elements as it's given, end quote. Intuitionists have argued that since associationism lacks the concept of holism, it fails to address how an accidental combination or modification could produce something new. According to this critique, associationism merely explains how a group of atomistic components could be added to or subtracted from without addressing how they join together in an unprecedented and significant manner. For example, in its critique of Gabriel Tard's associationism, Miki writes, but how does a single unified form come together from such an intersection, end quote. Elsewhere, he argues that associationism illegitimately presupposes the unity of the conscious mind. Some intuitionists go further than merely citing holism, maintaining that it is necessary to explain the manner in which holism transforms a set of individual components into a cohesive whole. Otherwise, intuitionism is little better than associationism. For example, Miki characterized Bergson's claim that the holistic process is merely instinctive and is inaccessible to intellect as irrationalism, and stated that, well, real intuition is something mediated in many layers of reflection, end quote. To further explain holism and the creative process that generates it, intuitionists have often turned to dialectical thinking. On this view, the interplay between contradictory oppositions is what produces novel wholes and can give us some insight into why these wholes have properties lacking in their respective parts. Was this part of the motivation for Nishida's dialectical account of creativity? There are aspects of Nishida's philosophy that seem conducive to such an inquiry. His claims about novelty being a matter of degree instead of a difference in kind suggests that novel wholes are comparable and that we might be able to cast some light on their synthetic composition. More generally, Nishida developed a conception of intuition that has greater harmony with reflective thinking than those of most intuitionists. If intuition is an embodied engagement with the world instead of a kind of passive apprehension, is it an iterative and deliberative process that can provide us with some insights into the inner workings of the creative process? Admittedly, I've yet to find any passages in which Nishida takes a deeper look at the inner workings of the creative process, though I also haven't seen any clear indications that he is opposed to such inquiries. Let me conclude the paper by discussing a passage from Miki that casts some light on what Nishida may have thought about this issue. Despite the fact that there are significant differences between Nishida and Miki's conceptions of dialectic, Miki saw himself as working within the broader framework of Nishidian philosophy and employed such notions as inactive intuition, formless form, the dialectical opposition between self and world, and a present-oriented conception of temporality. For example, near the end of The Logic of Imagination, he writes, quote, "Experience is established in the present where past and future are tied and originally involves inactive intuition. This inactive intuition arises where self and world are in contradiction And this unity of contradictories becomes the content of this intuition through the synthesis of the imagination, end quote. Thus, it may be possible to use elements from Miki's writings to cast light on Nishida. As far as I'm aware, Miki's most explicit discussion of the creative process is found in Chapter 1, Section 3 of The Logic of Imagination. Here, Miki discusses Wilhelm Dilthey's 1886 essay, Poetic Imagination and Insanity, a work that was also touched on by Nishida in Art and Morality. Here, Miki endorses Dilthey's psychological account of the inner workings of the creative imagination as an insight into the logic of imagination. Though he notes that this account lacks the kind of transcendental grounding that Miki finds in Kant later in the book. According to Dilthey, our psychophysical being enables the transposition of the internal and external. Quote, and these are all quotes from Miki. Quote, we interpret our internal states or render them sensible by means of external figures and animate or spiritualize external figures by means of the internal states, end quote. Mental images are formed and altered according to the holistic connections in a person's mind that are suffused with feeling and emotion. Though these connections usually restrain what kinds of images are produced, quote, in dreams or madness, this control is diminished or is lost, and the mental images unfold and combine in an unfettered manner. In the imagination of poets, by contrast, such connections are at work, but the usual force of emotions, feelings, and the system of sense organs freely unfold mental images by transcending the limits of the actual, end quote. Though Miki doesn't mention it here, Dilthey's account can also help us to understand how the synthesis of the imagination resolves contradictions between the self and the world. According to Dilthey, as external figures are transposed into the mind as mental images, these images are composed in a manner fitting the holistic connections found there. Presumably, the reverse happens as well, namely, the external figures alter the holistic structures in the mind to some extent, depending how different they are from one's preconceptions. In addition, it seems to be the case that the mental images in the mind will continue changing over time along with the holistic connections in the mind. And they would be altered more intensely when they are subject to the instances of the creative process described by Dilthey. According to Dilthey's model, this is how one's conception of the world is modified. Dilthey also notes that these images can be externalized, which is something that would in turn impact the world. To summarize, Dilthey's model of imagination can explain the creative interplay between the self and world discussed in Nishida's later writings. Dilthey's model also provides a way to explain how inactive intuition, as Miki puts it, is, quote, mediated in many layers by reflection, end quote, as, quote, a single point of the present that gathers together the infinite past and leaps into the future, end quote. As I've noted, Dilthey's model suggests that thoughts and experiences are continually synthesized into the holistic connections of the mind, and that this is the form in which the past is able to contribute to later creative works. In conclusion, Miki's discussion of Dilthey's account of the imagination helps elucidate some of the concepts he appropriated from Nishida's philosophy. It's unclear whether Nishida would have considered a psychological model like this one, an appropriate way to represent the dialectical interplay between the self and the world and between elements of time. But it does provide some pathways to explore if we hope to further clarify Nishida's views about the creative process.
We can start from the room.
Yes, maybe my
Professor
question,
Kim?
the most simple question. So thank you for your lecture. My question is, you mentioned lots of the interpretations on the creativity, stuff and the for example, for Nishida, from with the conception of the creativity, what is the question to which Nishida want to answer? So with the concept of creativity, what does he want to explain, or to whom he wants to, how can I say, opposite?
Yeah,
Why he mentions about the creativity at all?
yeah,
My
that's a good question. I can think of a few things, but there might be others that are more important. I mean, one is he sees his project as in part an attempt to kind of synthesize Western and Eastern philosophy, and the philosophers he was reading at the time, many of them were interested in the concept of creativity, and so being able to incorporate that's important. I mean, also, I think he saw his this philosophical project as being kind of part of or related to the attempts to kind of modernize in Japan that were ongoing at the time, and so creativity was seen as an important topic, not just by him and the other Kyoto School members, but by other Japanese philosophers and people in China, et cetera. So I think that's part of it. I think more generally being able to develop a kind of new and interesting conception of creativity that he thought that that Buddhism brought some resources to for the discussion that could connect to some neglected aspects of creativity, right? And I guess that connects to, I mean, religious issues are very important for him, especially in the latter part of his career, or at least more explicitly then. And so that's enabled him to connect the concept of creativity, talking about nothingness, to these religious issues. I get those are just a few ideas. So there might be some other reasons why he was interested in the topic.
Thank you.
Does it have something to do with for example, the misunderstanding of the Buddhism, that in Buddhism everything stays the same, or there's nothing new in Buddhism? Is the creation, that concept comes from the Christianity, that God the creator, the God, the creator ex nihilo. So in the Western philosophy and Western theology, the creation, that is always a theological implication. So can it be that Nishida also want to insist that something similar can be also found in this Oriental or the Buddhistic worldview. I don't know at all,
Yeah,
so, but just is my imagination.
So it's a very deep point, a very good point. So if if there are no questions, so we can discuss. So for example, if Professor Kim put this question to me, so why for Nishida the topic of creativity is so important? Oh, it's a very difficult question, of course. So first, I would say I will try to make some distinction which Nishida, the first Nishida, the last Nishida, the middle. And I appreciate very much in your presentation that you try to make a discourse that involves the entire figure of Nishida. Nevertheless, so it was very good, but I will try to make some distinction. For example, for the young or the first Nishida, I think Berzon and Fiedler are very important to understand the sense of creation ontologically or also aesthetically. And that is different from the late Nishida, for example, where Fiedler, for example, disappears and the idea of artistic creation becomes a self-determination of the world, no more the act of an artist as a subjectivity that creates something. But nevertheless, I would try to answer why creativity for Nishida in every period of his life is so important. Is because more or less clearly, Nishida's thinking start from something that is a kind of becoming without any ground, that we can say in Buddhist term, call it nothingness or emptiness. So from the start, even if Nishida doesn't use this concept in his first books, but the problem is we live in a reality that is standing in becoming, and this becoming is free, is creative, because there is no mechanical determination, neither mechanical determination nor theological determination. So every single instant must be free, absolutely free and creative. This is because the basic way of thinking of Nishida is not metaphysical in the sense that you have a substance or a ground, but is basically ungrounded. So probably my understanding of Nishida, this could be a point that we could discuss. I don't know if I understood what you mean with holism or holistic view, but I think we spoke a little bit together before the workshop about Deleuze, his reading of Bergson. So if this holism, this whole must be open, as Deleuze stressed in the first book of Cinema. And open means, in this sense, without a mechanical determination or a theological determination. It means free and absolutely free and creative in every moment. And you can find this probably in An Inquiry into the Good, where he speaks about pure experience or immediate experience. In the middle period of intuition, reflection, in self-awareness, where he speaks of absolutely free will. Of course, when he speaks about absolute nothingness in the middle period. And of course, in the last part of his career, when he speaks about a creative world, what is for me interesting, I don't know, Rex, what is your opinion about it? That this creativity in the first Nishida seems related to the subject. But then when Nishida develops his thought, the creation is in the world itself. And the subjective creativity is a self-expression of the creativity of the world in a dialectical relation, as you said. And I find very interesting that this act of creativity shifts from the subject, from, for example, from the genius in Fiedler's terms, to the world itself. In An Inquiry into the Good, there is a passage that I like very much where Nishida writes, "It's fine if you think that Sesshu, the famous painter, paints nature, and it's fine if you think that nature paints itself through Sesshu." And in my opinion, it always is the same creative act of painting, if you want, but you can see it from the point of view of Sesshu, of the point of view of nature. The first Nishida, in my opinion, thinks creativity more from the point of view of Sesshu. The late, more from the point of view of the so-called nature or the world. But what is your opinion?
Yeah, no, that's interesting. And it's something I'm gonna have to think about because, you know, as I've been reading Nishida, I've just been finding him emphasizing the subject, you know, especially in the early stuff. And so it's interesting, you know, this claim that, you know, everything is free and creative. You know, in the early works, you say that, I mean, I could see that insofar as he is talking about, you know, human being, you know, kind of entering nothingness, you know, and, you know, nothingness is the ultimate source here. And so, yeah, you know, the painting is really coming from nothingness rather than Sesshu, right? Though, you know, from our perspective, it's coming from Sesshu, right? And also, I mean, I think you alluded this to, you know, the idea of pure experience where there's this, you know, kind of constantly, you know, this changing, you know, where that would mean that everything is, you know, kind of changing in that respect. So I'll have to think about that. Because yeah, on my reading, or at least what I was presenting in the paper, he's, you know, very like, or, you know, when he talks about, you know, I quoted these passages where he talks about nature, you know, the early middle period, and he says that, you know, physical objects, biological organisms are not creative. And so he is, you know, narrower than, say, Miki or you know, other figures that I mentioned, who include, you know, nature, even though it might not be as creative as human beings, it's still creative. And that's, you know, there are people, you know, scientists and philosophers today who are arguing. There's a lot of interesting research into like animal intelligence and animal, you know, that, you know, so there are several people today that argue that animals are creative, for instance. And so, yeah, I was going with like, you know, kind of working from those kinds of comments. And then, you know, pointing out that in his notion of the creative world, he is kind of seems to be shifting somewhat, but I took it as only a partial shift insofar as he was saying that the world is creative insofar as our conception of the world changes, right? There was that passage I quoted about like the physicist's, you know, model or understanding of the physical world changes. And so the physical world changes as a result, right? And so it was, you know, still seemed to emphasize, you know, the self that was kind of conceiving the world, right? But he does talk about a kind of interaction. I mean, maybe there are changes happening in the world, and that, you know, kind of triggers in a certain sense the physicist to, you know, so, you know, I can see it from that vantage point that, you know, there is a way in which like nature painting Sesshu, that early example, a way that, you know, nature is kind of inspiring, you know, the self to kind of reconceive nature, right? So yeah, I'm gonna have to think of, those are the helpful comments. I'm gonna think about that. But yeah, I think there is this other side of Nishida where he is emphasizing the human being, and he doesn't want to, he kind of resists, especially early on, granting, creativity to, aspects of the world outside of human beings and nothingness, right? So, yeah.
Yes, I would, if I continue
Yeah, please.
with you, so I agree with you, but at the same time, maybe we could consider that when the late Nishida speak about natural world or physical world, and when the young Nishida probably quotes Seishu and nature, the sense of nature is different. So probably related to Seishu and the act of painting, nature is much more similar to what in the Chinese, Japanese traditional way of thinking is Shizen or Jinen, so a kind of spontaneity or naturality that develops itself by itself from itself. And when the late Nishida speaks about biological world, the physical world, is referring to the modern Western way of thinking nature that are probably not the same. And of course, and also when we think to physical world, when Nishida said that there is no creativity in the physical worlds because it is based on mechanical necessity, and when he's referring to quantum physics, to Bohr theory of experiments, is trying to think two different kind of physics. So when therefore Nishida felt a deep sympathy for Bohr, for quantum physics, because in quantum physics you can see a kind of dialectical relation between the observer and what is observed. And so a certain kind of freedom or creativity that is excluded if you think in the term of the classical physics. So
yeah,
therefore, basically, I
have
understand.
an interest in quantum mechanics, and that's in during the later period. Okay, yeah, that's helpful.
So because yes, from the 30s, half 30s on, Nishida was fascinated by quantum physics because it seems to him that quantum physics was much more near to his idea of creative world that he calls also historical world sometimes, than the classical physics where determinism is.
By Einstein theories too, when Einstein came to Japan.
But Giacomo, you have a question, I think. Sorry, I spoke too much.
Some comments like, so first of all, thanks for the lecture, which was really clear, and there are many points that, I reached some really similar conclusions. Like I also appreciated in the terminology, I just started studying Japanese philosophy, so I'm obsessed with using the right words to call things and categories. So this recurrent reference to individual and world, which is exactly a thing that I like to do because I come from an existentialism background. So I always talk about subject, but I said, okay, now it's a different background indeed. So which kind of word should I use when Nishida talks about subject and reach the same conclusion? The individual is the category that Nishida uses. But besides this, yes, coming to this problem about creativity and also the role of religion, both Buddhism and Christianity, I would say that on the one side, of course, Nishida wants to promote this vision of creativity that comes from Buddhism, because of course his goal was to create dialogue between Western and Eastern perspective and philosophy, but he wanted to do this through a Buddhist lens. So this is relevant. And when you were mentioning creativity in Christianity, I think this instead could be one of the enemies he wants to fight, because creativity in Christianity can indeed be ex nihilo And Nishida wants to avoid this, especially at the beginning, when, as you were mentioning correctly, it was all a matter of degree. So if we read the no Kenkyu, an inquiry into the good, it's always for Nishida a matter of degree. He says, most of the times we tend to distinguish between this and that, but actually it's not a real distinction. It's only a matter of degree. So this was his first interest. And then, I mean, we all know that Nishida is the kind of thinkers that reasons while writing and while answering to the comments that he receives, also to Zenno Kenkyu or from Tanabe later, as you were mentioning. So later on, he goes on and on, or deeper and deeper in the topic. And from this matter of degree, he starts developing these different dialectic between the individual and the world. And in this sense, I really appreciated your reference to the situational creativity, which is exactly what we can find in Nishida. It's not creatio ex nihilo, this creation from nothing, but I mean, there is also the world in this relationship. And so it's not a totally free creation. So going on, he slightly changes his interest in this relationship between the subjective creativity and the world. And we know that the last Nishida, which is the one I didn't read, but should be like this, switches to a more social and historical dimension, and then political also, because I mean, the events leading to the Second World War were asking him, and not only the events, also physical people, were asking him a reaction, no? So I think that it's true that there is this evolution in Nishida's thought, and this situational creativity is a central concept, but I would say that the subject becomes more relevant rather than less relevant. I mean, the subject is connected to more elements. So in the latest Nishida, also the world and the historical dimension come in. But I still would say that the subject is more and more central in Nishida. And I think you really touched the point when you were stressing somewhere in the second part of your speech, of your lecture, that there is this, you say, this dialectic between the individual and the world, but it is the individual that starts creating something new, that starts this dialectical relationship rather than the world. So I think that this perfectly frames Nishida's conception and how it evolves.
Yeah, to elaborate that a little bit. I mean, I think that this is related to the change that happens in his conception of nothingness, right? I mean, nothingness was really at the fore early on. And so even though individual human beings are an important locus of creativity or important source of creativity, it's still through them entering nothingness. And, the idea of pure experience, I mean, this kind of goes beyond, I mean, I think that Enrico, you're right, that's insightful, that it goes beyond the individual in a certain sense, that, in place or in, pure experience, I mean, there's a sense in which there is no more individual, right? But with him, kind of changing his conception of nothingness and kind of decentering it, et cetera, desubstantializing it in the later period of his thinking, I think that does, put, the self more on center stage, right? Because it's, nothingness is still important. It's operating, in the self, but also in other things, and there's transformation, but the self becomes, I think, more prominent. I mean, I made a similar point about God becoming a more prominent issue in the later Nishida because of the change in his conception of nothingness, that now God, and a personal God, of a different conception of God than he had been using earlier, becomes, kind of, more prominent in the discussion. So. But I mean, I think the points you were making, Enrico, about the change in his conception of nature are interesting to consider here. That, nature, I mean, if you think of it in terms of quantum mechanics, I mean, nature is something that is more open than, kind of classical physics allows, right? So, yeah, I mean, I don't know, that's something I'm going to have to think about because I wasn't aware of his interest there. Um, I mean, and I think that, I mean, he does, in a way, open up more space for, I mean, he calls it a creative world, for a reason, right? That there is more emphasis placed on the role that the world plays in inspiring us. I mean, maybe there are some hints, there sounds like there's some hints of it that I hadn't thought about, like the Seshu painting or nature painting Seshu example. But it's definitely more prominent, like in the later work, that the impact that nature has, and maybe that's a way for him to to kind of balance things, that getting rid, or I don't know, that the notion of pure experience and place, kind of disappearing or moving in the background or being reinterpreted. How do you make sense of how can you kind of reintroduce some of those elements here, right? That the way that kind of nature can be spontaneous, maybe the idea of a creative world is a way of doing that in his later thinking, that I don't know. So he's able to make some of the same points that he made with the concept of pure experience or place. So.
Let's see if someone on Zoom wants to enter. Professor Abe, please.
Can you hear me?
Yes, perfectly.
Oh, okay. Thank you so much for your very rich lecture, and which I really enjoyed. Thank you so much. And let me pose a very simple question at first. My question addresses Nishida's notion of jikaku, which could be translated in English as self awakening or self-awareness. And I was wondering why in this lecture, why you didn't refer to this notion of jikaku, self-awakening, when it came to the notion of creativity, because in my personal view, the notion or the idea of jikaku, self-awareness, is closely related to the Nishida's idea of creativity. And why? In my personal view, according to Nishida, you can be creative, or you can do creative activities when you not only make or create something in relation to other entities in the world, but also as far as long as you understand or newly re-understand yourself, so to speak, from within. So this element, the latter element of re-understanding or remaking oneself from within, this latter element too is important to the notion of creativity in my reading of Nishida. And in this sense, I personally believe that the notion of jikaku, self-awareness or self-awakening, is significant when we understand or interpret Nishida's idea of creativity. So I would like to much more I would like to know so how you connect the notion of self awareness with uh, so your uh, lectures lecture your lecture of concerning the notion of creativity today. Thank you.
Yeah, great. Thank you for your helpful question. I mean, unfortunately, there's a very simple answer. I didn't consider self-awareness in connection with this, but I'll have to in the future. I mean, I did talk about self-transformation and how that's important for in Nishida's conception. And so, I think it'd be possible for me to incorporate a discussion of self-awareness. I mean, I know it's an important notion. You see it in some, titles of essays, I think from the early 30s. I'm trying to remember, the self-aware system of
Yes, but the concept of Jikaku is already
early and
1917 or
yeah, true. So yeah, that's something I'll have to look at. I think, I mean, one way of exploring it is, in the later Nishida, when nothingness becomes like something internal, a kind of self-negation, right? As a kind of, looking into oneself, that might be a fruitful way of exploring this. But yeah, I'll have to, I mean, I think the notion of, at least from what I was discussing, this idea of self, transformation, even though it's very dialectical, I think it comes out much more strongly in the later Nishida, at least as far as I'm aware. But if self-awareness has a much longer, kind of history within Nishida, then maybe there's some hints of it in the earlier writings that, kind of presaged this development in the latter part of the statement. So I'll have to look at that. But yeah, thanks for the suggestion.
So let me thank you, and let me provide a very small tip for
Sure.
your lecture today,
Please.
if I may. As you already know, the later Nishida in 1930s, I believe, often often uh, uh, write write or discusses writes about or discusses in Japanese 創造的世界の創造的要素 which could be translated in English as the creative element of the creative world. According to the view of the late Nishida, you should understand yourself via jikaku, so via your own self-awareness. So you should understand yourself as the or one of the one of the creative elements of the historical or creative world, and by doing this, you can do something creative, something creative in the historical world, and so into which you have been thrown. So, like Heidegger's notion, Geworfenheit. So, being thrown into, I mean. And so, as far as you can be a part of the historical world which itself is creative, or which does creative activities. You can do something creative. So this is a picture of this idea proposed by or provided by the late Nishida. So I'm not sure, but hope that by drawing on this idea, the idea of the creative element of the creative world, you might be able to enrich or make your discussion powerful. So when you discuss when you discuss the Nishida's idea of creativity.
Yeah, thank you.
So much.
Yeah, I mean, it makes, I mean, another, thing that topic that I discussed in the paper that this brings to mind is, in the earlier Nishida, there was a sense of like, the more deeply you emerge into nothingness, the more creative you are, because you're entering a deeper unity, with the world, right? Whereas in the later Nishida, it's more of like since the nothingness is found within the self and it's kind of self-negation, it's kind of, more deeply entering oneself. And that can be, interpreted as self-awareness, right? I mean, self-negation might be thought of as, kind of denying the self or changing the self, but also could be understood as a kind of self-awareness that you're gaining a deeper self-awareness. And that's where one, I don't know, that's where, creativity becomes, I think along the same lines, is more, there's more creativity found there. The deeper one enters that kind of interiority and there's an implication that I guess from the earlier work that would have more of an impact on the world, right? Having that, the more deeply one, kind of enters into the self through that self-negation, if that makes sense. Thank you.
Thank you.
That's helpful.
This is also the topic of self-negation is very interesting. For example, in the first Nishida, you cannot find this concept. So there is no negation. It is a pure affirmative thought, very Bergsonian in this sense. And also the meaning of negation in Nishida is something that I cannot, I'm not so a good scholar of Nishida to make a good explanation, but it's something that should be considered in which sense self-negation, it is at the same time self-affirmation. In which sense Nishida used the concept of negation and affirmation, hite and kote, in which sense, in which degree hite is negation in Western sense, referring to which philosopher, to which idea of negation.
I mean, it does seem to be related to dialectic, right? So, I mean, there's this, the negation, of, contradictions, et cetera, maybe he's connecting it to this Buddhist notion of self-negation there. At least that it appears that way to me in the later work. So, I mean, it's, self-negation leads to, kind of transformation through this a deeper dialectical relationship with the creative world, right? But yeah, I'm not remembering any references. I believe you. I'm not remembering any references to negation, but, with nothingness becoming internalized, then that would make sense that, he would become interested in that as a concept, right? So.
Can we say that this concept of self, I don't know, but my imagination is that this concept of self-negation and self-affirmation, can it be some influence on Nishida from the Christian faith or Christianity or Christian philosophy? For example, the base concept of the human being in Christianity is the human being is a sinner, but that concept of sin, that is when I find myself standing in front of God. So in front of God, I'm just a sinner. So I should no way but to die. So I'm negated. But that moment is the moment from which I am reborn. So can it be that this dialectic was some influence from the Christian phrase or Christian world?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know, but it makes sense to me. But with his, the emergence of a kind of personal God in the later Nishida, I wondered, like, is there some kind of Christian influence there? And then it would make sense, like self-negation, has Buddhist connotations, but I hadn't really considered, the Christian ones. I haven't seen any, the passages I was reading for the paper, I didn't see any, I didn't notice anything that, that suggested to me like, the Christian notion, but I wouldn't be surprised if they're, if that was, part of the reason for it.
The last book is was logical. There he quotation from the Old Testament, the Isaiah, the chapter 6. When we see God, we experience this. So that can be some idea from which Nishida got this insight of this self-negation, self-affirmation. So in that sense, God is not, when Nishida says God is personal being, then that does not mean that God is some object that stand in front of me, outside of me. No, there's some interrelational. Yeah, this is concept of personal. And also it's very clear that Nishitani, for example, his personal means at the same time impersonal. So he said personal and impersonal God. So I don't know, but Nishida also has the same concept.
So I don't know if it's the same concept, but then we should consider another thing that I am not able to do, but the relation between Nishida and Christian thought during his entire career.
Yes.
You can find waves, some periods when he's reading a lot of the text, and other period not so intensively. The topic of sin is already from the start. So in an inquiring field, when he quotes the figlio prodigo, the prodigal son. Yes, and connecting this topic to Oscar Wilde and to Shinran. So Buddhism, Christianity, related to the topic of sin, for example. But also in, for example, intuition, reflection, self-awareness, 17. So in the last part, when he is, if I remember correctly, quoting Origen,
Christian theologian.
Yeah.
Origen
Yes, related to the question of sin. And in the middle period of his career, there is a time when he's reading Kierkegaard, for example. So you should consider more than I can, more in detail, his relation to this kind of topic. So in my opinion, Nishida is aware of Christian thoughts from the beginning. So
yes.
Not something that he reached only in the last part, but his attitude towards, mediated by his personal way of thinking, his Buddhist experience, probably changes during his career. Are there any other questions from the people on Zoom?
If there's no question, only if there's no question from Zoom. So and you mentioned about this very interesting, the comparison. first, the subjective creation, the Sesshu created the world, painted the world. But the world creates itself through Sesshu. So approximately that concept, the subject side, or if we can say the objective side. But I think these two sides are the two sides of the same coin, I think. Of course, our emphasis can be moved from one side to the other side, but actually we have to say the two things at the same time. So I like the Zen Buddhist point from a Korean Zen master. He said approximately that's right. We all know that a Zen master got enlightenment when he saw a flower blossoms. But we do not know that that flower got enlightenment when when the flower ceased. That a Zen master got enlightenment to see itself blossoms. So these are the two coins, the same, the two sides of the same coin. The subjective enlightenment and we can say the enlightenment of the world. That is what we can say the Zen and Huayan. This is the same element, I think. So of course we can move from one side to the other side, but actually we have to say these two sides. Yes, that's just my comment. It's very interesting.
Nishida in that passage said something, if I try to translate in English, it is good if you say A, and it is good if you say B. So it doesn't say you have to choose A.
No, yes.
Both are good.
Yes.
It depends from which point of view you enter in the question. From related to Nishida's aesthetic thought, I said simply in my interpretation, probably the first Nishida, Art and Morality, for example, because he's also very influenced by Fiedler's thought, is more from, is trying to understand what does it mean that Sesshu, in a state of no mind or no self, paint nature. On the contrary, the late Nishida, there is one essay with a long title that I cannot remember, even if I translated it. Nishida start quoting Fiedler, but then moved to the Vienna school of aesthetics, to Riegel or Wöhringer. So the attempt to understand art history without artist's name, they said. No? So it's not that art is made by Michelangelo or Raphael, but there is a style or a period in Western art history that so it's more on the side of nature, paint itself through Michelangelo or to nature, of course, not in the sense of the modern physics or the way of thinking.
What period was that later essay from?
Oh, let me think. Maybe in 34.
Okay.
It could be
That makes sense.
the act of creation as it is a very long title that I don't remember. Maybe someone on Zoom can title. It's not yet translated in English. There is a partial translation in German. And this shift is very clear. And Nishida start from the Oxford, Cambridge, I don't remember, ritualist historian like Jane Harrison, try to understand the birth of myth or ritual or religion from the self-determination of the historical world, and art develops from the ritual. So this kind of theory Nishida is trying to rethink in that passage. But someone wrote something on chat. Probably the title. Someone provided the title, but I cannot read because okay. How can we artistic production as act of historical creation? Or if I try to maybe wrong, I don't know. So this is a very interesting for me essay to see how Nishida's aesthetics changes from the first period to the last, according to the changing of his philosophy itself.
Yeah, did you I read a essay you wrote about aesthetics. I think you might have.
Yes,
discussed it.
maybe yes.
I'm yeah, I need to track that down.
So because in Italy the interest towards Nishida started from the Department of Aesthetic of Padua University, where I come from. So my friend asked me to translate these materials. So I didn't publish it, but I translated and we discussed about this topic some years ago.
Are there other places where he discusses art in the later period, or is that the main text?
As far as I know, probably as an essay entirely devoted to aesthetics. As far as I know, there is only this one. But of course, Nishida, developing other arguments, can insert some deep insights in his text. But so I'm not so a good specialist of Nishida to I'm not able to say it's absolutely so. As far as I know. Other insight. It was published in 1941. Oh,
1941, okay, thanks.
I was completely wrong. So after that, I mentioned technology. So from here, you understand how bad I am as a specialist. Okay, I don't see any other people entering in the discussion. So maybe it's time that we can finish our workshop. And so, Professor Gilliland, thank you again.
That's all your questions, and I appreciate that. So thank you.